Everyone, I just wanted to carry on our conversation on history of facial plastic surgery from our previous talk on Harold Gillies and Archibald Mickendoe. And I wanted to re-highlight the fact that in the first half of the 20th century, the art of aesthetic plastic surgery was frowned upon. It was considered a quote-unquote lesser medicine. But the level of scorn heaped upon physicians who practiced plastic surgery varied depending on how showy and extravagant they were and how willing they were to engage with the public. And I wanted to talk about two important figures in the history of facial plastic surgery that lived on opposite ends of that spectrum. So the information I'm going to be talking about comes from three sources, and those are by Sandra Gilman, called Making the Body Beautiful, A Cultural History of Aesthetic Surgery, published in 1999. Elizabeth Haken, who published Venus Envy, A History of Cosmetic Surgery, published in 1997. And then a book published by Dr. Brian Mendelsohn entitled In Your Face, The Hidden History of Plastic Surgery and Why Looks Matter. So the first person I'm going to talk about is John Orlando Roe. He was an ear, nose, and throat surgeon from Rochester, New York, who was one of the founders of aesthetic rhinoplasty. And he got his start reconstructing collapsed noses of patients who suffered from syphilis. He was actually the first individual to perform a closed, or what's called an endonasal rhinoplasty, in 1887. And a closed endonasal rhinoplasty involves incisions entirely inside the nose. And it's a really beautiful, useful technique that's not taught as often anymore. I was taught the technique from my fellowship director. And the paper he wrote about first performing this technique was entitled The Deformity Termed Pug Nose and Its Corrections by a Simple Operation. Now, he was considered one of the more noble aesthetic plastic surgery physicians. He published a lot on the work he did on tip rhinoplasty and rhinoplasty of the dorsum, or the bridge of the nose. He was not showy, he was not extravagant, and he didn't advertise himself. On the opposite end of the spectrum was a physician named Joseph Sheehan. He was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1885 and emigrated to the United States. He was impoverished after the death of his father, but managed to work his way up to Yale Medical School and then traveled to Europe to train with Harold Gillies, actually, at Sidcup in World War I. He then returned to the United States, to New York, to practice medicine. And he became enmeshed in a scandal after lecturing to the New York City Police Department. He invited a New York Times reporter back to his office to talk about the lecture he gave. And instead of writing about the lecture, the New York Times reporter noticed how extravagant his office was, took photos, and ended up publishing those. And I love a quote from him that I think summarizes his personality and summarizes the personality of some of these physicians. And this quote is, "Be mindful of the fact that in the modern world it is vitally true that one's face is his fortune. Rather, it is often very palpably his misfortune, and against this he is entitled to remedy." He was very good with the public, very engaged, and he was a good surgeon. He just was looked down upon because culturally at the time, that was a frowned upon act. So the surgeons at this time had a range of personalities, they had a range of abilities, but you have to remember, in the early 20th century, it was frowned upon to advertise, and it was frowned upon to demonstrate your results, and it was frowned upon to be out there in the public eye. I think that what's important to recognize about this time period and take away from it is really the most important thing is that you're a caring doctor who takes really good care of his patients